Good afternoon, everyone. How are you guys? How are you handling the cold? Okay, welcome to all of you to the FAB. Thank you for joining us for the second edition of the Inspiring Peacemakers series. This second edition marks an important step for the Peacebuilding initiative as we work on shaping the conversation on peacebuilding from an interdisciplinary perspective. Today, we will build bridges between trade and peace. Before we begin, the Peacebuilding Initiative would like to thank again the FAB, the Nederlandse Philanthropy Alliance, the Center for Trade and Economic Integration, and of course the Graduate Institute for their continued support. Now I'm pleased to introduce our guest of honor to say a few words about the significance of this discussion on the trade and peace nexus in our current time. Please welcome Her Excellency Ms. Nina Tornberg, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Sweden to the WTO, as well as Chair of the Working Party on Somalia's accession to the WTO. Please welcome.
Thank you. And if that's okay, I stand, or will I be half a body in the camera? No, that's okay. So thank you so much for the invitation and the possibility to talk to you here today. Well, peace building, I think that's perhaps something that is more important today than ever before. If we look to the situation around the world as it is right now with multiple and really complicated conflicts in different continents. So the field of studies that you've picked is of course extremely important. And I think events like this is also very important because peace building, of course, is complex. It involves many different aspects, and trade is one of them. And I'm very happy that you picked trade as the topic for today's event, to look a little bit more into the role of trade in peace building. And I personally think it has an important role to play. So I will just offer a few remarks from my point of view, and looking forward to hear also the rest afterwards, so to say. So if I look to my own country, Sweden, we have of course been very fortunate. We've been living under peace for a very long time, but we used to be one of the poorest countries in Europe, and trade had a very important role for us in our journey from that situation to where we are today. I mean, today we are a welfare society, we have a strong innovative industry and so on, but trade was really an important part of that journey. And I think building economic prosperity is also an important element of fostering long-term stability and building lasting peace as well. And this is of course nothing new to you, but it deserves to be pointed out again and again, I think. I think also that trade with other countries that give rise to interdependencies between countries that also have the effect of being able to prevent conflict. So that's also an important part of trade. And of course, it's also extremely important to recover after conflict. So there are different aspects of this, and this reasoning was also actually part of the founding idea for the European Union, what is today the European Union, and which started as a peace project, I would say, by the idea that if you pool and coordinate the production of coal and steel, you will create this kind of dependencies between what used to be adversaries, and in that way you can also, I mean, it will be preventive of conflict, it will be stabilizing, and it can also foster economic development. And so this project was, as we all know today, it was really successful in fostering further economic cooperation and thereby also stability and growth for the member states involved. So what I want to say by this is that trade can be a powerful transformative tool. It has, of course, to work together with other measures. To improve the conditions for trade, we need investment, we need infrastructure, we need some kind of institutional frameworks that can also uphold the rules. A rules-based trade is, of course, extremely important to give companies the predictability and the courage to invest and to expand your trade and also start trading with other countries. And because Sweden has benefited a lot from trade and from the multilateral trading system with the WTO, it makes a lot of sense for us to also support other countries who want to make the same kind of journey. That is why we are one of the biggest donors to the funds and programs of the WTO that aim to support developing countries who wish to do the same kind of journey, so to say. And these funds, they are promoting capacity building in the partner countries by providing technical assistance and other kind of support. So really quite practical support, I would say, in order to build institutions, in order to build technical competence, because it also requires quite a lot of technical competence to be really able to play by these rules. And I would say that not only our development cooperation with the WTO, but also in general, the Swedish development cooperation puts a lot of emphasis on trade, just because we see this close link between trade, long-term development, and stability. So the objective is to bring about the conditions that are conducive to employment, to economic growth, trade and investment, but also, of course, building skills and knowledge is an important part of this. And try to re-establish and reinforce the market functions. And this is important already in a conflict-affected country. It's important to, as soon as possible, try to re-establish the market functions in order to contribute to countries and people being able to make their own development journey and not being dependent, so to say. And this, in turn, of course, can also contribute to building the resilient societies and long-term stability. I think also that the link between trade, stability, and development is also confirmed by the accessions to the WTO. We had some recent accessions. We were happy in August to welcome 2 new members, the Comoros and Timor-Leste. So 2 countries that have been conflict affected and are least developed countries, but have been able to make this journey. And I think that shows also that there is a driving force in being able to be part of that system. I myself, I'm also, as Nils mentioned, I'm a chair of the working party for the accession of Somalia. And that is another country that is not yet a member, but they have a will to join. So they are working hard in order to do that. They have already joined the East African community, and I think this demonstrates not only a strong commitment, of course, from Somalia, but also a view that trade has an important part to play when it comes to building the stability and long-term economic development. So, one final remark perhaps on inclusion. I think inclusion is a very important part when we're talking about trade and how we can, how the benefits can benefit all, so to say. And this inclusion is, of course, also an extremely important part of peace building. So we have to ask ourselves the questions: how do we make sure that not vulnerable groups are left behind? How do we include the youth? I mean, young people is often a very large part of the population, not least in conflict-affected countries, but they are very often excluded from the decision-making processes that actually affects their life. So that's something we have to ask ourselves. How do we engage better with young people, other groups, in order to also foster this cohesion and resilient societies? And that goes for trade as well. It has to be inclusive. So to conclude, as I said in the beginning, I think events like this is very important. It's important to meet and discuss between different disciplines, different perspectives on how to best promote the better world that we want to see, actually. So with that, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to listening to the next speakers and to listening to all of you. Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks, for reminding us of the importance of open dialogue. And I think one key takeaway I learned from your remarks is that, and through the example of Sweden, is that we have to help ourselves in order to help each other. So that was really important for you to mention the journey of Sweden in becoming more and more stable so that it can help other LDCs in this process. So let's move on. I would like to introduce my colleague, Shruti, who is the president of the Peacebuilding Initiative, just to say a few words before we move on.
Thank you, Melsa, and thank you, Ambassador, for such lovely words. It's a hard act to follow up on such amazing remarks. So I won't even try. I just wanted to say that I echo all of the sentiments that the Ambassador has made, and I am really, really honored to be a part of such an amazing initiative. The Peacebuilding Initiative is something that I have been a part of since my time here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Started my master's over a year ago at this point, and it has been really like the focal part of my master's, and that's because I have been able to meet so many amazing people, not just my colleagues and peers, but also amazing speakers such as Sean and Kérshia, who we will be hearing from shortly. But I just wanted to, really give a huge shout out to my team for making this all happen, for continuing to express such passion and support to the Peacebuilding Initiative on top of all of the assignments and exams and finals that we have going on already. So just thank you all so much, and a huge thank you to all of our supporters, the FAB, the Macleod Philanthropic Alliance, CTEI, and TASK for all of your continued support in making sure that peacebuilding initiatives, realities, or dreams become reality. So thank you all, and I'm really, really excited to hear. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the both of you now. So Kérshia and Sean have shown greater engagement in the preparation of this event over the past few weeks. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you both. So we have Sean with us today. He is the head of the International Trade and Investment and a member of the Executive Committee at the World Economic Forum. To differ a bit on the forum's trade and investment activities, they are structured in 3 pillars around geopolitics and governance, facilitation and technology, as well as environmental and social outcomes. But before this, Sean also headed several industry communities at the forum. He worked in the logistics sector and he was a management consultant. And then Kérshia Cavele, who is the first project coordinator for the Trade for Peace program, hosted by the Accessions Division at the World Trade Organization. Again, before joining the WTO Secretariat, she worked at the African Development Bank Group, where she supported the management of $11 billion of a regional integration program, which had a special focus on conflict-affected regions across the continent. Kérshia is also an alumni of the Institute, so welcome back. Please put your hands together for your speakers. Great. I'd like to kick off our conversation with some stories about you. Your careers in trade, economic integration, investment have brought you to influential roles and institutions with significant global impact. Could you share with us, and particularly with our young professionals in the audience, your story of how you each began your journey into this field and how your paths have evolved over the years? Perhaps we could start with who would like to go first?
I can go first.
Thank you, Kérshia.
Thanks, thank you, Milza, for the great introduction. And thank you all for joining us to hear about our career paths, which are definitely not straightforward. They're not direct at all, even though some of us have been engaged in, I would say, the international relations field since our academic years. So from my side, I did my bachelor's in international development, and I got the passion to engage in grassroots initiatives at that stage. And one experience that I still hold to my heart is there used to be a program there that we used to give extra lessons to children from underprivileged neighborhoods. What it made me notice, I don't know if you know, South Africa is one of the countries with the highest level of inequality. You could have one road separating the poorest neighborhood and the richest neighborhood of South Africa. And you could see that in the same territory, how people lived differently according to the opportunities that they got, according to the access that they had. But on that road, I then came to the Graduate Institute, like Milza mentioned, where I did my master's in international relations. And I always had this passion and looked at international relations from the lenses of international development. So how does the discussion that happened between states in Geneva, in New York, actually affect the lives of people from countries where I studied or where I came from? It was also at the Institute that I started getting more interested in the idea of trade. Although I didn't do economics, I took some classes at the economics field. That was interesting because it opened my mind to understand a bit of what it meant, the theory, the discussion that was happening at the time. And it was then that I got the opportunity to do an internship at, I don't know if you know, CUTS International Geneva. So this is an NGO that stays here, and they try to discuss, raise awareness, and have projects on how trade impacts LDCs and how that can be transformed into projects. But when I finished my master's degree here, I went back home and I got the opportunity to do an internship at the African Development Bank Group. What is interesting about this internship is that it was the first opportunity I had to work on programs financed by a big investor in my home country. But at the time, I hadn't realized that my home country was also an FCS. I knew of the story. I studied throughout my primary and secondary, but it never really clicked, I would say, that I was actually from fragile and conflict-affected states that had been facing fragilities and violence throughout the years, and even until now. So there I focused on monitoring, evaluation, as well on youth empowerment and women empowerment, but through very specific sectors of the strategy at the time, which were agriculture, transport, and social economic development. I then had a short stint where I did some work on social entrepreneurship, social innovation, because what was noticed through the engagement with young people is that the businesses that they were coming up with were not mainly about raising profit, but they wanted to try to solve a social issue that they were facing. And at the time, the bank wanted to know how to put it in a framework that worked with the instruments that the bank already had. And my job at the time was to try to come up with a framework and a program where we would have social entrepreneurship initiatives drained or mainstreamed into the different operations that the bank was financing. But like I said, it was a short stint because I had to come to the WTO. I was accepted into the Young Professional Programs in 2020. I was there in the SPS committee, the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement Committee within the Agriculture Division. And in that work, mainly, it was to support the Secretariat's work in supporting the members on the engagement with the SPS agreement. But if you remember, in 2020, it was COVID. And that was interesting for me, mainly because I was seeing firsthand the adaptation that the WTO was going through to have the members still engaged in what was relevant work to them. And I was also seeing firsthand the notifications being received on the provisions that members were putting because of COVID-19. So it was interesting to see the level of transparency also raising, because there was somewhat of a campaign about trying to have members being more active with the WTO to also communicate that would support the transparency and for us to understand where multilateral trade was going. So this was my first experience with a rules-based multilateral trading system that I had since I started working. When that finished, I went back to the African Development Bank, but this time around, I worked in the Regional Integration Coordination Office. Like Milza had briefly introduced, they had a portfolio of about $11 million, and this was made up of projects, mainly infrastructure projects, that would work towards integration through trade, through migration, through cooperation. That's what we would understand as integration at the FDB. And one interesting part is because the idea was to try to bring stability throughout the continent. But there were very focused areas within the continent that the integration tried to tackle. Those being the Sahel region, the Horn of Africa, and the Lake Chad Basin. So that was my first engagement on seeing how integration/trade actually contributes to resilience. And when we talk about peace building, in many cases, we are talking about building resilience of fragile and conflict affected states. Because when we used to look at resilience at the bank was every country faces issues. We all have to deal with them. And the main issue is that there weren't institutions, there weren't capacity within the country to deal with those issues. That's why the word resilience was the forefront instead of peace building. So after that, I came here to be the project coordinator of the Trade for Peace program, with the idea of trying to see where the Trade for Peace program can go beyond the initial conversations that we're having, beyond the research that has been done, and what is concretely doable with the Trade for Peace program within the WTO, but obviously respecting the main mandate of the WTO Secretariat, which is to support members on their deals with trade, the trade agreement, the trade disputes. So overall, I understand that sometimes we see as having a very direct link between getting out of school and you work right where you want to be. But like I think you have noticed through my experience, you have to pass through different fields and through different experiences, building on some sort of a unique skill set that allows you to be at the specific work that you're doing now. So that's my experience so far.
Great, thank you,
Thank you.
Kérshia. I think many of us can relate to doing different things here and there to be able to achieve the position we want to be. Now, Sean, would you like to share a little bit about your journey to this field as well?
Sure. Hello, everyone, and thanks, John. Thanks, Ambassador. Thank you, Kérshia. Really glad to be part of this conversation with you all. So, how did I get here? So, as you know, Milza mentioned, I started off as an engineer, so I love coming here. I get to look at the trains. It's my favorite part of the day. And then I moved from there through business, working in the logistics sector particularly, and which later on became linked to trade. And then from there I joined the World Economic Forum, and initially for a number of years I ran a number of our industrial sectors, clusters there, on chemicals, mining, and looking particularly in the mining sector, working a lot actually with some conflict-ridden areas where there are lots of questions around how do you get benefits for local communities. But anyway, after a few years I was asked to help start a trade and investment practice, which we did about a decade or so ago. And so the obvious question you may be asking is, okay, what's the link with peace? I mean, that's all great. And I'll be trying to think, it's maybe a little bit tenuous, but I think there are links between trade and peace. Obviously, the ambassador laid them out in a nice structured way. And I think over the past decade or so, I've been able to touch on probably 3 or 4 of those connections. So maybe the first point is that of just providing basic necessities for people, because I think often in a conflict situation or disaster situation, people really need to be provided with food, with healthcare, with shelter, and that calls on trade, investment, supply chain capabilities. Clearly in a conflict-ridden situation, you're unlikely to have all of those available. And so making sure that the supply chains work even at a basic level is important, because otherwise, if you have people who are destitute, you have instability, clearly that is more likely to lead to conflict. So that's the first area. Second area is providing economic opportunity, providing connectivity. And I think one of the things that probably we're most clear on is that one of the best ways to help people stand on their own 2 feet is to provide them the opportunities to connect to other markets, whether those are far or close by. Provide those opportunities for commerce and trade. So again, this is an area where we've worked. The ambassador mentioned that Sweden has been supportive, and indeed, they've been very generous in some of our work in this area. A major donor on new work that we're doing around the world, but also in some troubled areas of Eurasia, in trying to make sure that those connections are made and to allow economic development. Third area I'd mention perhaps, and again, Ambassador touched on, is making sure that the outcomes of trade and investment are as fair and equitable as possible. Because clearly, if you have a case where you have egregious unfairness, economic injustice, then that is more likely to be a situation where people think that, perhaps they can better their own outcomes by resorting to violence, as opposed to really giving them a stake in stability, current setup, and a kind of give and take arrangement with others. So that's a kind of third area we've been able to work on over the past few years. And then the fourth area is perhaps even one level higher, is around that kind of governance, resilience, the existence of a rules-based framework. Because here, I think we do need to try and aim for a situation where we are able to counter things which might lead to a threat to peace, whether that's shipping weapons to bad actors or putting ourselves in a situation of extreme vulnerability and over-reliance. So that's perhaps a fourth area in which trade and investment, if well handled, can lead to peace and stability, and if poorly handled, can perhaps generate instability. So I can talk about all of those in a little bit more detail, but those I think have been the links which I've been able to draw between trade and peace in the past few years. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks to the both of you. I think in your remarks you've kind of defined what peace means, and although we all agree that peace building is a complex process, at the end of the day it goes really back to the basics: healthcare, education, stable jobs, being able to afford 3 meals a day. So that's really important, and that's how we build peace, and that's how we can thrive collectively and individually. And it's also important that we respect each other in this process. Moving on to the second part of this conversation, how does your main area of work at the World Economic Forum and the World Trade Organization connect with the broader goal of sustainable peace building? So if you could tell us a little more specifically how both organizations approach the trade and peace nexus. So we could start with Sean now.
Sure. I mean, let me kind of build on what I was laying out with those 4 different areas that I think we've been able to work on. So I think the first one I talked about was, excuse me, relief operations. So when I joined the forum, as I said, I worked within our supply chain practice, and at that time we set up something called the logistics emergency teams. This was actually right around the time of the tsunami in Southeast Asia, which I know many of you are too young and you may not even recall, but it was, a massive disaster. And one of the things that we saw at that point was that there was a lot of goodwill from the private sector to provide support, but it was very uncoordinated. And so you had, plane loads of blankets kind of blocking the runways in Indonesia, and this was not helpful. And so the decision was made, let's try and see if we can create a more coordinated means by which the private sector can prepare in advance and in a coordinated way support the UN logistics cluster and all the various humanitarian agencies. And so that's something which has lasted for the past 20 years, that's still active today, working in Lebanon and Gaza, providing warehousing, port support, trucking operations and the like, to get that emergency humanitarian relief in to try and support vulnerable populations. So that's the first area. Second area I mentioned was this economic development and connectivity. And we've been running for, again, about the past decade or so, something which is now probably the World Economic Forum's largest project, which is called the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. So this has been working to essentially support the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. And what it does is it helps reduce the administrative burden of trade, makes it easier, hassle-free. And this is particularly important for smaller businesses, because clearly large businesses often can deal with these difficulties, but if you're a small, medium-sized enterprise, it's very hard for you to overcome some of these practical barriers. And this is very important because allowing smaller businesses to have take part in trade is really important for providing stability, because you want to have a kind of broad base of economic exchange. You may have a very large volume of trade going on, but if that's all coming from one mine or one oil rig or something, that may actually lead to instability, because you're more likely to have conflict over resources, for example. So I think this program has been important. As I mentioned, Sweden has been a big donor of that, and that's active in some 30, 40 maybe economies around the world. I talked about how to get fair outcomes. So we run a number of programs. One, for example, helping indigenous communities to have a voice in trade and investment, and to try and make sure that the various communities, disadvantaged communities, are able to take benefits from trade and investment relationships. We run a program actually together with our colleagues at Task here on trade and labor, and again, John has been helpful on that. And what we try and do there is to try and help the development of both voluntary and legal frameworks to get better labor conditions throughout global supply chains. And that work is, I think, particularly important at the moment as we go through environmental and digital transitions. And that work is at the moment doing deep dives in Indonesia and Kenya. And I mean, also on the environmental side, I think it's important to get some form of environmental justice through trade. And so we run a number of programs, one with the WTO called ACT, on Action on Climate and Trade, where we're helping economies, developing economies in particular, to adapt their trade policies in a way that makes them more likely to be successful in a carbon-constrained world. Fourth area, which I touched on, was this one about resilience and governance. So clearly at the World Economic Forum, what we do at our core is we're convening, we bring people together for dialogue. And clearly, our belief is that that is one way to avoid conflict, by allowing people to come together and talk through their differences. And that's clearly the case currently on trade and investment tensions. We run a large number of dialogues where people can actively put on the table what are some of the problems they're facing, and how can they perhaps try and mitigate those. So I think those were the main things. I should just quickly reference the fact that actually we've had Great collaboration with a number of students from this organization. We worked with a team about a year or two ago who were working to try and explore, what are the links between trade and peace in the Sahel region. I think they highlighted really the importance of even quite high-level trade frameworks in supporting stability by strengthening institutions, by strengthening some of those institutional frameworks, and thereby, helping contribute to peace. I have to, admit that we haven't built anything very, very concrete on that yet. And I also don't want to pretend that, any of the other pieces of work which I've mentioned would necessarily be, of that great help in a, area of kind of active or budding conflict. But I do hope that they're able to contribute, at least in some way, to stability or helping economies to recover. Stop there.
Thank you, Sean, for your honesty and for sharing a little more about how the World Economic Forum, through various activities and channels, try to promote stability and peace building as well as resilience. I'll now move on to Kérshia to tell us a little more about what the WTO does in this area.
Thank you, Milza. How to follow up after Sean's diverse work that he's doing at WEF. But maybe I can start with the program that I'm coordinating, the Trade for Peace program, which is an initiative that came out of a discussion from a group of fragile and conflict-affected states in the WTO that were acceding to on the process of acceding to the WTO, and they realized that the WTO can actually be another platform where discussions around the similar challenges that they face on engaging on the multilateral trading system. So the idea of the program was really to be a platform where the nexus of trade, peace, humanitarian and development fields could be engaged, discussed, so that we have innovative ideas on how to support what we call FCS. And here, I think the most visible work that the Trade for Peace program has been able to provide is regarding the awareness of the link between trade and peace. And although our program is called Trade for Peace, we are aware that trade can also be a driver of violence or a conflict. And it's in this framework that we are trying to push this perspective of how positive trade can be, and try to push for policies that contribute to this concept of trade really being a powerful tool to transforming societies. And I think the Trade for Peace program, it's an initiative that goes beyond the parameters of the WTO organization in terms of looking at trade just as an economic perspective, from an economic perspective. This is the program where we see that trade has the power to go beyond providing economic stability, but also bringing together communities that are not engaging, or bringing together divergent communities to discuss on issues that they value or they provide the same amount of value. And when we think about the Trade for Peace program, we are thinking the contribution it does to the peace building field is raising the awareness and intention of trade experts to use trade as a tool for peace building. So going beyond the sphere of work that they already do. But beyond the Trade for Peace program, we have been doing some work, and I think Ambassador Nina mentioned quite well the accessions process itself. It's a contribution to peace, and you may ask, but how? What do you mean? When we talk about peace, and as defined by Milza, we are talking about good governance, we are talking about transparency. So the accessions process itself, it's a reform process where the countries have to look at their foreign trade regimes and do the reforms that go along with what the WTO rules mandate, and so that they can be in accordance with that. And most often than not, you find that the reforms that are implemented by FCS, they support the transition to a more transparent and increase the capacities of the state in being participants on that. One good example that we had is that Liberia acceded in 2016. And just for you to see, there is a trend at the accessions. The last two acceding countries that Ambassador mentioned, Timor-Leste and Comoros, are in the World Bank's FCS list. But the two previous ones are also FCS. So you had Liberia and Afghanistan at the time that acceded to the WTO, and the remainder of the countries that are trying to accede to the WTO are also more than half of them are actually fragile and conflict affected states. And I think they see this process as an opportunity to bring reforms that can bring stability to the country. I think I was going to talk about Liberia. One great example of Liberia is that post-accession, when they finished the process, they implemented a 7-point framework which had the principles of the WTO accession in it. So transparency, good governance, as well as a dialogue between the diverging members. So these are principles that go beyond the trade regimes that they are mandated to approve before they become members of the WTO. And one particular tool within the WTO as well is the trade policy review system, which on a periodic basis, depending on the status of the country has to present their trade regime. And this opens the transparency part of the country and brings accountability to the country itself. When we have accountability and there is transparency, the idea is that more people become involved into what's actually happening, and the information ideally is available for all. When we think of the WTO, at its creation, it was ideally to remove trade-related disputes after the Second World War. Even though it's not written in any of the articles nor the GATT that preceded the WTO, the essence of the WTO at the time for the creation of the GATT, and which then led to the WTO, was to prevail in a sustainable peace post-World War II. And you can see this when there was an attempt to have the International Trade Organization, what we call the Havana Charter, and in the agreement, it clearly states for the purpose of peace building on trade-related disputes. So you can nuance the existence of the WTO, even though it's not clearly stated. But now with the Trade for Peace program, there is a reinitiated focus on how the WTO can contribute to peace building in FCS. So that's how we see the work there.
That's great. Thanks to the both of you for explaining a little bit about what the World Economic Forum and the World Trade Organization through the Trade for Peace works to facilitate peace through trade. I think it's important to remind ourselves that there are many definitions to peace, and it's always good to mention them, highlight the importance of good governance, transparency, resilience for many, stable jobs for others. And it was really important for me to ask the both of you what the WTO and the World Economic Forum does, because when we think of those two big organizations, we may think that they're very niche, based in trade, economics, but to what you've said, you've shown to our audience that there are many cross-cutting issues that you're trying to address along those lines. Peace be one of it. There are also like humanitarian work, environment, gender. So I think it's a great lesson to all of us to know that those organizations are trying to promote a more comprehensive and holistic way of building a better world for all of us. I do have a few questions, but I'd like to give you a chance to ask yours. So feel free to share any comments, any questions or feedback you might need from our speakers. Anyone? Yes, sure.
So I really thoroughly enjoyed all of you guys' speeches and everything that you said. Personally, I have been working on a thesis topic that has to do with neocolonialism and trade in that aspect. And with the definition of trade, sort of, I mean, as I said, there are many definitions, but I'm wondering if there is this sort of like economic dependence that sort of arises through this interdependence. And of course, trade can work for peace in many different ways if it's done correctly. In cases where it's not done correctly, how do we sort of get around this neocolonialist dependence that sort of arises through these situations? Anyone can answer this. It's just a sort of personal dilemma that I've been facing within my own research, so I thought I would face it to you guys as well.
Can I add a question?
Yeah.
Tag on the question related to what Lucy had mentioned. So we all know that WTO has open market that brought a lot of economic development and wealth to many countries. I think today one of the biggest debate is there have been a lot of people that have been left behind in many countries, right? Trade at the end of the day, for everybody that, or for a certain group of people who have benefited from it, there are many who have been, taken advantage of. I'm sure that's really big in the minds of WTO and especially Sean from your side, from a private sector perspective. So we'd love to hear some observations or thoughts or reflections on your side.
Right. You want me to go? So fantastic questions. I don't have the answers for either of you. On the kind of neocolonialism, I guess one thing you can try and aim for is diversity in your economic relationships, right? So that you are not dependent on anyone, overly dependent on anyone. I think having some level of interdependence is probably good. It does foster the peace where you're not just going to walk away and but you don't want to be over resilient, so over dependent. So to the extent that you can have a diverse economic relations with all sorts of your neighbors, your friends, that may be one of the simplest steps you can take. Does it totally answer your question? Probably not, but it's one thing I would do. On kind of your question, John, around how trade has driven growth perhaps, but still there's been inequality. What can you do about that? I think it's very important to think of, there's a whole number of domestic policy levers which need to be pulled, and that we should think about those in an international context as well. And so just to give two examples, competition policy and tax policy, right? Because it's no good if you have fantastic growth, but it all goes to one big company and they don't pay any tax, right? Or one, a small number of individuals. So even the kind of the most basic set of policy decisions you want to make is to make sure that through antitrust competition policy you're preventing over dominance, you're allowing kind of diverse set of actors in the economy, and then you're taking some of the benefits through tax and using them through social services. But I'm sure there's way more you can do, but those would be two things.
Well, thank you for the questions. In fact, they're really good questions. But on the neocolonialism question, on the idea of trade and peace link and how can that lead to economic dependence, you're right, because in fact trade can lead to an economic dependence. But when we think about trade, it's mainly we are trying to see the advantage that members can get out of joining to the multilateral trading system. So that's how we think at the WTO. And for us, oftentimes, countries that tend to be dependent on one commodity, let's say oil, they tend to engage in such types of relationships. That's why the reform tries to advocate for diversity on the economy. And I think it's a bit related to what Sean was saying, relying on more than one stakeholder or trade member. But also I would like to bring out that when we think about multilateral trade system, it's also important to look at a very interesting concept that's growing currently, which is regionalism. And members or countries are taking the value of regionalism because they understand that it's easier to trade amongst shared values, which are mostly the members, and then try to use that GVC that's in the region to engage on the multilateral trading system. So there is that perspective of trade that could contribute to the non-dependence on one specific member, or like usually it's said, the big economies trying to take advantage of the small economies. So I have that. And yes, on the marginalized people, and this is something that's being thought of at the WTO more and more. If you see the WTO report of 2024, it was on inclusiveness, and the goal is to rethink globalization. So the WTO Public Forum 2024 was, the theme I think was re-globalization. I think my colleagues can help me with that. And there was a lot of focus on climate change, the increasing trade on services. Sorry, John, you asked this question. Yeah, the increasing trade on services, the rule of AI. So how do we try to put in the people that haven't participated in trade by using the tools that are emerging? And AI was one of the tools that was identified to see how can trade leverage the participation of them. But we are aware that not everyone will participate in trade. We are very well aware of that. And we also understand that there needs to be complementary domestic laws, like Sean was saying, that support the people that do not directly participate on trade. So I hope it helped.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Kérshia and Sean. Yes, please.
I think we all know that trade and peace are deeply interconnected, each influencing the other. For example, for stable countries, they can attract easily foreign investments, and vice versa, countries where economic interests of different stakeholders are at stake, they kind of slow down the pace of conflict escalation. So my question is there any way we can make is there any way we can persuade, let's say, international corporations to invest in countries that are not fully yet at peace, without compromising those countries' negotiation leverage, let's say? Because if a company is coming to, for example, an LDC and they want to invest there, then they're gonna ask for preferential treatments, for example. But is there any way we can ensure foreign investments coming into countries that are not yet fully at peace without compromising social inclusion and country sovereignty?
Yes, Amanda.
Maybe I'll ask a question also related to what our colleagues just asked. It's about how to really foster meaningful interaction, because what we usually say to the WTO is that it's a very technical area, it's a very technical field, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult to have these trade experts, and perhaps in the World Economic Forum it's a similar situation, these economic experts to really speak the language of these peace practitioners, and how to create these opportunities, for example, for investors or the private sector to come to fragile and conflict-affected situations. What are the best opportunities, and from your experience, that led to this meaningful environments? And maybe this is also expanded to the colleagues that work more in the peace field. What else can trade and economic experts do to create this space for interaction?
Maybe I can start trying to address the question of how can we try to ensure foreign direct investment in SCS that hasn't had a sustainable peace for quite some time, including the marginalized. In fact, when we think about foreign investment, there are critical indicators that they look at when they think about investing in a country. And but now I can tell you that the investors, I've been engaged in some conversations that there has been conversations about how the risk of certain countries are analyzed and they are given the rating that's usually used. I can't give you a right answer right now, but I can assure you that there has been a dialogue on how to go beyond the economic indicators that are given on the profits that investors can have in return by investing in certain countries. But I can also tell you that a move towards stability, even though the peace hasn't been there for a long time, a move towards reform, domestic reform, increased capacity can also signal a better pathway for foreign direct investment. And that's why for us, the accessions process is one tool that contributes to peace, because even though we have countries that haven't been in peace for too long, like let's say 2-3 years, and they go through this transformation, really it's a signal to the international market that we are open to engage in this path of transparency, good governance, and capacity, and the efforts that are being done. So that's the work that's being done. I hope it helped.
Let me maybe just try and take the questions in reverse order. So firstly, in terms of the meaningful interactions. So I think we have to remember trade is also trade in services, for example, education, so that, all of you here probably coming from different countries, you're part of trade. And, hopefully when you go back to your home countries, positions of power and influence, you'll be a little bit less likely to invade Switzerland than if you hadn't studied here, that kind of thing. On the point around how do you get investment into, countries in conflict, there are various programs out there. We run one called the Humanitarian Resilience Investing Initiative or something, which tries to work with, providing guarantees for investment into difficult situations. Personally, I think maybe the best thing that you can do is recognize that often there's an enormous opportunity in investing in places which are just emerging from conflict. There are many investors who are very interested in that. So how can you sort of help them to make sure that investment is smooth and also, follows best practice in terms of, good governance, anti-corruption, all that kind of stuff, which is often a risk when you're investing in a fragile state.
Thank you both. And I think from a peace building side, I think maybe the worry when we hear about trade and economics is like the jargon is very technical and people are maybe afraid of all the indicators and statistics. But like you mentioned, both of you, especially you, Sean, when we look at trade and services, it's more than those like big numbers. We have education, health, and transportation and telecommunication. So I think if we try to explain those words, those terms in a less scary way to the peace building community and like try to explain clearly that this can work together, I think in that sense, both experts could create something meaningful out of the discussion. So this is the almost the end of it. Ambassador Tornberg, Sean and Kérshia, thank you so much for speaking to us with an open heart. As we wrap up the session, if you, in 3 minutes, would like to share with our audience any advice or any lessons learned throughout your experience, to close up the session. To go about this from now.
Well, I think this has been really interesting. I think that so much good questions have been posed and very good answers. So not very much to add actually from my side, but I think it really showed the many different aspects of how of the interplay of trade and the potential in trade to play a role in building peace and stability. And perhaps because this was among the last things that were said, I mean to spur the interest of companies to invest and to do trade in a country. I think there's a lot of force in what Kérshia also mentioned. I mean, showing that there is a will to make some reforms, to bring about some stability when it comes to institutions, because that brings about predictability. And that's something that is easy to understand, that also companies need in order to go in and invest. But I think by signaling that, there's a lot of potential really to also have this interest in investing and building trade, and by that building stability.
Thank you. I totally agree. Thank you so much.
Sure. 3 lessons learned, I think, personal ones. So firstly, always give the credit to other people, right? It's much better to have a project succeed with somebody else's name on it than to try and get your name on things. I think that's very important. Second, and very kind of, I think relevant for peace building, is try and avoid conflict at like pretty much all costs. I'm not saying, maybe not all costs, but you can still stand up for things and be determined and put your point of view, but bear in mind that whoever you're working with across the table, you're likely to work with them again in the future, or their friends or their relatives or whatever, so it's really not a good idea to burn bridges. Try and keep that working relationship going, even if you have very different points of view on something. And third thing I think is just be patient. I mean, we all go through lots of dark days where everything is falling down, nothing is working, but stick in there, and usually better days come up later.
Well, I think I have some somewhat similar points, but I wanted to talk about adaptability, how important it is for you to be open-minded and adapt to the particular situation. And I understand that when it happened to me when I left my master's degree, I was very sad being in the development world, in the international relations world, but I also had this passion for development, and sometimes development is not at an international level. It's really just a context-based, country-based, and be open to learn on the ground, because that will bring a very good skill set for when you come and discuss with actual experience from the ground. I think collaboration. Sean is absolutely right. Don't burn those bridges. It's important to value the collaboration. You never know when you're going to re-meet the same people. It's a cycle. You can start working in Geneva, go somewhere else, and then come back to Geneva, and those are the people that you will need to continue the work and also engage. And really, also be open to engage more with the current discussions that are happening. I understand we all have to do our work, get our good results so that we can get our degree, but always keep an ear out or an eye to what's happening in terms of the international organizations or the fields that we're engaged with, so that you know what you're going to go to eventually when you get there. And really, resilience. Just there will be a lot of falls, ups and downs, but keep resilient and knowing what you can bring to the table.